Some scenes in this program have been reenacted, including the depiction of certain crime scene investigations. In the Arizona desert, a detective needs to link a murderer to a crime scene. The only witnesses are two bean pods. A grotesque murder on a quiet beach has police baffled. A forensic geologist hopes to transform a spoonful of sand into a witness for the prosecution. After years of hunting for a clandestine grave, the only thing binding a killer to his victim is a tree root. In the past, rural landscapes have offered safe haven to murderers hoping to keep their crimes concealed. Now, thanks to the burgeoning fields of forensic botany and geology, the killer who puts his faith in nature's silence sows his own seeds of destruction. The Sonoran Desert. How many lives have been brutally ended in desolate landscapes like this one, with only an audience of trees to bear witness? Today, those unlikely observers are gaining a voice with which to expose the guilty. The Caterpillar Proving Grounds outside of Phoenix, Arizona, was a thrilling diversion for a man heading home one Sunday in May 1992. Cutting through a dry wash, he was struck by something out of place in the raw landscape. He moved in for a closer look. Face down, beneath a canopy of Palo Verde trees, lay the nude body of a woman. She wasn't breathing. Officers from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. From the condition of the body, it appeared the victim had been murdered within the last 12 hours. Her clothing was scattered nearby. Braided wire and shoelaces were wrapped around her wrists and ankles. It seemed the killer had spent some time with the victim before leaving her here. Detective Charlie Norton led the investigation. The victim was identified by her fingerprints as 30-year-old Denise Johnson. She'd been arrested for prostitution. Hours passed as the team pored over the crime scene. They hoped to weave tatters of evidence into the coherent narrative of a homicide.
She had a white t-shirt, just an undershirt, was wrapped around her neck, and it looked like maybe she had been strangled.
As the team examined the torn clothes for clues, a fundamental piece of the puzzle came like a plea from beyond the grave. The insistent beeping from a pager broke the silence of the desert. Was some friend, unaware of Johnson's fate, trying to reach her? Or was this the forgotten property of a careless killer? A court order was obtained and the pager company contacted. The owner of the pager was traced through its ID number.
The pager subscriber was a fellow by the name of Earl Bogan, and he said that his son Mark had exclusive use of the pager because he didn't have any telephone communication, and basically that was the only way that the family had to get in touch with Mark.
While police processed the crime scene, a man came forward with a statement. At 1:30 the previous morning, he'd noticed something odd, a white pickup truck with amber clearance lights, whipping out of the proving grounds. The driver ran a stop sign, then flew toward the interstate. Combined with the pager information, this eyewitness testimony would give Norton a leg up on the investigation. When Norton learned that Mark Bogan owned a white pickup truck with amber clearance lights, it seemed to him he found the killer. He would now have to prove it. Bogan, accompanied by his wife Rebecca, agreed to be interviewed at the sheriff's department.
I'm going to talk to her, I'm going to talk to him.
In an interview with police, recreated here, Rebecca said that on the night of the murder, Mark came home at 2 a.m., his face bloodied and scratched. He told Rebecca he'd been in a bar brawl. But Bogan told police a different story. He claimed he'd picked up a hitchhiker who fit Denise Johnson's description and had sex with her in his truck. Bogan admitted lying to his wife because he knew she'd be disgusted with the truth. The story was coming together a bit too neatly for Norton, and he wondered whether Bogan was twisting the facts to fit the evidence.
And I think somebody made contact with him and told him that the sheriff's office investigators were looking for him. So I think that kind of basically tipped him off, and he came up with this story.
According to Bogan, after their encounter, he and the hitchhiker argued. He ordered her out of the truck, and as she left, she swiped his wallet and pager. Bogan chased her and fought to recover the wallet. He claimed to have left Johnson on the side of the interstate, alive. Norton suspected that Bogan was telling only half the story.
I suspect probably that what Mark told me when I interviewed him, as far as picking her up, having an argument and so forth like that, I suspect all that's probably true. But the part that he left out is where it happened and that he ended up killing her.
Norton believed that Bogan was a murderer, but he wasn't getting any help from the suspect. Not only did Bogan adamantly deny killing Denise Johnson, it had been years, he claimed, since he'd even stepped foot in the Caterpillar proving grounds. Bogan's admission that he had spent the evening with Denise Johnson would, ironically, make it more difficult to prove that he had killed her.
We got nothing on this guy. Everything that he's told us shuts down all of our whole case. He had sex with her, he knows who she is, the whole shooting match.
Bogan's story, spotty as it was, had just defused an arsenal of forensic weaponry. DNA analysis of body fluids or fingernail scrapings could only prove something which Bogan had already admitted. On the evening of May 2nd, 1992, he and Denise Johnson had sex, then fought. Norton's only hope of bringing Bogan to justice would be to link him to the scene of the crime, a little patch of grass under a cluster of Palo Verde trees in the proving grounds. Bogan's truck was seized and searched, but nothing linking Bogan to Johnson's death was found. Two seemingly unexceptional Palo Verde seed pods were collected from the truck bed. But thousands of these trees grow in southern Arizona. The pods could have come from anywhere. It hardly seemed like the kind of evidence that could tie a man to a murder. Struggling for a way to link Bogan to the crime scene, Detective Norton returned to the proving grounds. Then, inspiration struck. Noticing a Palo Verde tree with a fresh scrape on it, he theorized that after dumping Johnson's body, Bogan's truck had brushed this tree, causing the pods to flutter free and land in his truck bed. If DNA testing could prove that the pods in Bogan's truck matched the scarred tree, Norton and his colleagues would be able to dismantle Bogan's alibi. But there was a problem. The test they envisioned had never been done before. To catch a killer, Detective Norton approached Timothy Helenjaris, Associate Professor of Molecular Genetics at the University of Arizona. Norton wanted to determine whether there was enough variability in Palo Verde DNA to distinguish one tree from another.
When I was contacted by the Sheriff's Department, they told me that they had some pods that were collected from the truck, and they thought they might have matched one of the trees at the site. They did remark that one of the trees had scrape marks, and so they had one particular tree in mind. So I asked them to collect pods from all the trees around the sites, but not to tell me which one was marked, and just to number them so it would be a blind study.
Using a cutting-edge technique called rapids for randomly amplified polymorphic DNA, Helenjaris rendered genetic profiles of sample trees and pods. The results were surprising. Palo Verde DNA appeared to be as complex as the human code. It seemed that individual trees could be easily distinguished from one another. Dr. Helenjaris first confirmed that the pods from Bogan's truck were from the same tree. He then compared that profile with DNA profiles from a lineup of 11 trees at the crime scene.
When we then informed the Sheriff's Department of which numbered tree it was, it turned out to be the one that in fact had the scrape marks on it that they were suspicious of to start with. So we felt pretty confident with our result there.
The noose was tightening around Mark Bogan's neck. He was arrested and a court date set. Armed with Helenjaris' findings, the prosecution was eager to confront the defendant with the silent testimony of a Palo Verde tree. But Bogan wasn't going down without a fight. To convict Mark Bogan of killing Denise Johnson, the prosecution hung their case on the admissibility of rapids, a legally unproven procedure. DNA analysis of humans had only been deemed admissible in Arizona courts a few months earlier. Using plant DNA to prove murder would be a stretch, and yet the entire case hinged on it. Bogan's defense team hired its own expert, Paul Keim of Northern Arizona University, to refute Helenjaris' findings in a pretrial hearing. If Keim could cast doubt on the validity of Helenjaris' technique, Bogan would likely walk out of court a free man.
So I think that the Bogan family hoped that my expert advice, expert opinion on the new DNA fingerprinting method that was being employed here would say that this was not a valid approach to forensic science and that this was not conclusive evidence that their son had been at the crime scene. Hey, Jim,
though he was brought into the case as a hired gun for the defense, Dr. Keim's loyalty was to science and the responsible use of laboratory testing. His mistrust about rapids was valid. Since its debut, the new technique had been known to give false readings if the extremely careful controls aren't maintained throughout testing.
In my opinion, it meant that we had to hold it up to a very high standard of scrutiny, and so that it was important that we understood everything that was done here and that it was done correctly.
When performed with extreme care, rapids provides researchers with an amazing new tool: the ability to look at an organism's DNA without any prior information about that species' genetic composition. The first step in the process is to get the DNA out of the pods. The seeds must be removed for accurate testing. Each represents a mixture of the tree's genetic material with the pollen that fertilized it, and would therefore introduce separate DNA into the test. liquid nitrogen instantly freezes the pod so that it can be easily pulverized. Once it has been purified, the DNA is ready for PCR gene amplification. This heating process increases a minute sample of DNA to provide technicians with ample genetic material for testing. When reconstituted with water, the seed pod's DNA will be invisible to the eye, but extremely revealing in other ways. The Palo Verde sample is now ready to yield its genetic fingerprint. In order to make that pattern visible, a process called gel electrophoresis is used. Blue dye is added to the DNA sample, which is then inserted into the lanes on a jello-like slab. Exposure to an electrical field causes the fragments in the DNA to separate. The resulting barcode is then illuminated with UV light and photographed. When hired by Bogan's defense team, Keim had been skeptical about Rapid's ability to conclusively differentiate between Palo Verde trees. But when he studied Dr. Helenjaris's data and the painstaking process by which he collected it, he was surprised at how definitive the results were. Influenced by his colleagues' findings, Keim was won over to the prosecution's side, and under oath, he couldn't refute the results. In Keim's opinion, the tree and the pod matched to a great degree of certainty. The defense team now faced an insurmountable setback by the researchers' fidelity to science. Bogan was going down.
When I examined the scientific evidence, the first thing that was most obvious to me is that the DNA from the pod that was found in Bogan's truck did in fact have exactly the same DNA fingerprint pattern as one of the trees where the body was found.
Helenjaris and Keim had placed Mark Bogan at the crime scene. After he had killed Denise Johnson, Bogan backed his truck into a tree and shook loose the evidence that would later convict him. The unrefuted genetic findings decimated the foundation of Bogan's defense. Bogan was convicted of murder and sent to prison for life. Helenjaris's trailblazing research established botanical DNA profiling as an effective forensic tool, giving a voice to two tiny seed pods, without whose testimony a murderer would still be walking among us. A world away from the Arizona desert, New England's coastline can be as desolate a place to die as the barren Sonora landscape. But like those seemingly inconsequential Palo Verde pods, grains of sand can be made to talk. On the morning of June 30th, 1994, a woman and her two nephews roamed Crescent Beach in Rhode Island. Buried treasure was the children's goal. What they found instead seemed to have been buried alive. Detective Arthur Clark of the East Providence Police Department was called to investigate the buried woman at the beach. The scene was more reminiscent of a Stephen King novel than anything the veteran detective had seen in person. 2 feet beneath the surface lay a woman in a red satin cocktail dress. Her life had been ended by multiple blows to the head.
We arrived on the scene about 10:15. We verified they were human arms. It appeared a body was buried in a shallow grave. We notified the medical examiner's office, who responded.
The victim's arms jutted out from beneath the sand, her hands clawing skyward in what seemed a final grasp for life. It seemed unlikely that she'd been buried alive. The medical examiner concluded that in her condition, the victim wouldn't have the strength to push her hands up through the sand. Someone had posed her into this final gesture, like a scene from a horror film. The killer seemed to be leaving a calling card, but his message was inscrutable. A circular pattern had been pressed into the sand around the body. In it lay a shattered watch face, its hands frozen at midnight. But for detectives, time raced forward. It seemed that some sort of grotesque ritual was performed here. They feared it could be the beginning of killings to come. They needed to work quickly before this killer struck again. At this early stage of investigation, vital clues might be masquerading as common trash. Cigarette butts, candy wrappers, and plastic cups were collected from the scene, along with samples of sand from both the surface and the bottom of the grave.
At the time, we didn't know what was evidence and what was not. So on the side of caution, we collected what we thought could end up being evidence.
Once we put the tape out, there's been nobody else in the area.
But before Clark could make sense of the eerie spectacle, he'd have to learn more about the victim. He didn't have to look far.
At around 8 o'clock that evening, a gentleman by the name of Christopher Hutter, who lived in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, called the Pawtucket police to report his wife missing.
The missing woman was 30-year-old Kendra Hutter. From a photograph, Clark recognized her as the murder victim. According to her husband, Kendra and he had lived more like roommates than lovers. Beyond the facade of domestic contentment dwelt a loveless marriage, bound together by financial need and parental obligation. They agreed to date other people. Christopher Hutter told police that Kendra had a date the night she died. Police later learned she met him through a personal ad. The divorced white male described himself as a cheerful, attractive father. Hoping to add a dash of romance to her life, she contacted him and they arranged for a date. On the night of June 29th, Kendra scribbled the man's name and phone number for her husband. The card read, Gary. Detective Clark identified Gary as Gary Tassone, a truck driver who lived with his mother and brother in Cumberland. He told police that he'd had 3 dates with Kendra Hutter, but denied having been with her on the night of her murder. The personable Tassone did his best to help Clark, telling police that he knew Kendra and her husband were having marital trouble. He suggested that perhaps the disgruntled Christopher Hutter was the murderer. When Tassone told Clark he'd been to the beach where the body was found, Clark asked him to come to the station to continue questioning.
After taking his first statement, there were several things that didn't jive. There were some inconsistencies in what he told us and what we had learned up until then.
In an interview with police, recreated here, Tassone adamantly denied having been with Kendra Hutter the night of the murder. As the interview wore on, however, he revised his story. He admitted he'd been on a date with her that night, but dropped her off around 11 o'clock. But that contradicted what Kendra's husband reported. According to him, Kendra never made it home that night. As far as they could tell, Tassone was the last person to see the victim alive. The detectives pressed on.
Detective Bilodeau and I spoke to him on and off for about 4 hours that evening. He never displayed any signs of emotion. He spoke very well. He was articulate, polite, cool, calm. He was not nervous at all. Pretty just matter of fact.
Clark continued to question Tassone, and as the interview moved into its 5th grueling hour, Tassone finally offered up an account. He and Kendra had been building sand castles when a noise startled him, causing him to inadvertently strike her in the head. In a panic, he buried the body in the sand. Considering the extent of Kendra Hutter's injuries, 7 strikes to the head, Clark rejected the story. There was no question in the detective's mind that the victim was killed intentionally.
What is it? What's wrong?
We don't know why she was murdered, but it was no accident.
On the surface, it seemed that Tassone was beginning to cooperate, but his statement made no sense, and Clark didn't know what to make of it. The tale he told of accidental death was far-fetched and implausible, but probably reflected a skewed version of what really happened. From what Clark had already learned of the case, Tassone was sprinkling his narrative with blatant lies. The resulting story was more confusion than confession. If only Clark could sift through the fantasy and get to the truth, he'd have the case sewn up. For now, Clark had to follow along and see where Tassone would take him. Under the guise of cooperation, the suspect led police to a roadside embankment where he said he ditched the shovel. It seemed like just another delay tactic, but a shovel did indeed turn up. With this discovery, the evidence seemed to be stacked on Clark's side. He had a murder victim buried in a ritualistic fashion. He had the alleged murder weapon. He had a suspect who could link the two together. But Clark only had Tassone's unlikely story to place him at the crime scene. To make the charges stick, he needed to construct a more coherent account of what happened. Armed with a warrant, police searched Tassone's car. The findings were slim, amounting to little more than a scattering of sand. It seemed Clark had found all the evidence there was to find. It was time to go to court. But at the start of the criminal trial in January of 1997, Tassone began to backpedal. Claiming to have been coerced into confession in exchange for immunity, Tassone recanted his story and explained away the sand in his trunk as having come from an evening with another woman at the beach. The shovel, he said, was just a shovel. Police couldn't disprove it. Suddenly, Detective Clark found the tide was turning against him. Without Gary Tassone's confession, Detective Clark and the Rhode Island police had to treat the case as if they'd never had a confession at all. To link Tassone to the crime scene, Clark needed solid evidence, but all he had was a handful of sand. Clark knew the answer was written here, but he wasn't able to read it. To build a case on such unusual evidence was beyond the resources of his small department. He had to call in the experts. He sent the physical evidence to the FBI's forensic geology lab, the only one of its kind in the country. There, geologist Bruce Hall examined the shovel, the blanket, debris from the crime scene, and the sand recovered from Tassone's vehicle.
The contributor, East Providence, Rhode Island, asked that we compare any soil or sand recovered from any of those items with some known samples of sand that they had recovered from the crime scene. In this situation, it was a beach.
To see the past in a grain of sand, that is Hall's mission. Each grain is a world unto itself, differing not only across continents, but across the length and breadth of a shoreline as well. Every child knows that sand on the surface of a beach is different from sand below. But what few criminals realize is that these differences can be measured and compared.
We have known soil samples from the grave. We have some, because it is a grave, we're dealing in 3 dimensions. We have some that were taken a number of different locations on the surface of the earth. As now we have a profile, if you will. We've got a hole in the ground that may be 1, 2, 3 foot deep. We have a number of samples now from various depths.
If the grains of sand found in the suspect's car came from the bottom of the excavated grave rather than the beach surface, as Tassone claimed, Hall would soon find out. To catch Tassone, Hall concentrated on the sand samples taken from the bottom of the victim's grave. If sand on any of Tassone's possessions matched it, Clark would have his case. Geologic examination takes a three-pronged approach. Samples are compared according to color, texture, and composition. The analysis begins with a careful look at color. This first test requires no sophisticated equipment, but it's essential for ruling out samples that would have no bearing on Tassone's case.
We view these under a number of different lighting conditions, daylight, again, fluorescent light, incandescent light, and compare their color. This soil representing soil recovered from the shovel, dissimilar to that collected from the beach. The blanket, again, at arm's length, we can see there's a color difference. This soil did not originate from the same source as the known soil. However, when we take a look at the soil from a vehicle, they're strikingly similar with respect to color.
The color comparison demonstrated that, judging from the sand grain evidence, the shovel may not have been involved in the crime. Or Tassone may have used it elsewhere before ditching it. It seemed like just another red herring Tassone threw out to get police off his scent. Tassone won that battle, but not the war. The sand from his car matched the color of the sand collected from the bottom of the grave. Hall moved on to phase 2 with this sample, analyzing texture. The sand is rinsed with water and exposed to ultrasonic waves, which vibrate off any silt or clay clinging to the sample. The sample is dried and placed under a stereo microscope. Now, Hall looks at the size and texture of the grains. A well-sorted sample consists of same-sized grains, like table salt, whereas a poorly sorted sample contains a variety of sizes, like a can of mixed nuts. Hall also looks at the shapes of the individual grains. Are they round, angular, or oval, for example? In the sand from Tassone's car, the grains were mixed consistently. The sample was said to be well-sorted and made up of well-rounded grains. So was the sample taken from the bottom of the grave. The walls were closing in on Gary Tassone, but Hall still had one more test to perform. He examined the soil samples under a polarized light microscope to determine their mineral composition. Different minerals have different optical properties when exposed to polarized light. These characteristics enable Hall to identify them.
Characterizing minerals is fundamentally no different than characterizing an individual. How tall is that individual? How much do they weigh? What is their hair color, eye color? And you characterize a mineral in the same fashion.
The sample from Tassone's trunk was composed predominantly of quartz, with a small amount of the mineral feldspar. When he looked at the sand from the bottom of Kendra Hutter's grave under the same conditions, he found the samples matched. Bruce Hall had now proven that Gary Tassone was in fact with Kendra Hutter on the beach the night she died. And, more than that, he proved that Tassone buried her body. Based largely on the strength of Bruce Hall's forensic evidence, the jury found Gary Tassone guilty of first-degree murder. He is serving a life sentence without parole. The strange man had lured a woman from the personal ads, beaten her in the head with a shovel almost 20 times, and buried her in a way sure to be noticed. The motive and meaning of his crime remain a mystery. Also unknown is whether this was the first strike of Gary Tassone. As he drove his truck across the country, did he place ads in other papers, luring unsuspecting women like Kendra Hutter to their deaths? Or was his first victim also his last? Though the grave markers may be erased by time, nature doesn't forget death. The world is forever changed for the family of a murder victim. The same holds true for the landscape in which a body is buried. 20-year-old Cher Elder was known around the Denver suburb of Lakewood, Colorado, as having a mind of her own. It didn't make for smooth relationships. On the evening of March 27, 1993, she had a skirmish with her boyfriend, Byron Powers. No doubt apologies follow after a few hours of downtime. To blow off some steam, Cher caught a ride to Central City, a seedy gambling town 1 hour's drive into the Rockies. Her escort, an older man, was good company, and her moodiness lifted as the night wore on. At 1:40 the next morning, Cher and her companion left the casino. She would soon join the ranks of the missing. Days passed with no sign of Cher. Her frantic father reported her missing to the Lakewood Police Department. Detective Scott Richardson was assigned to the case. Missing person cases are a tricky call. Richardson didn't want to throw his department's resources behind a massive search, only to find that the time and energy had been misspent on a girl who'd left town to cool off.
It's a tough investigation. How involved do you want to get on a missing person case, and how complex do you want to make a missing person case to find out they're laying out on the beach in Maui somewhere?
Richardson had a bad feeling, however, that Cher wasn't on vacation. His first objective was to identify the man with whom she'd last been seen. A surveillance camera at the casino had captured his image.
We did not know who that male was, and that was the last time she was seen alive. A friend of hers had seen her in the casino with this male.
The man was identified as Thomas Luther, an acquaintance of Cher's boyfriend, Byron Powers. Cher had been introduced to the older man shortly before her unlucky gambling trip to Central City. The more he learned about Thomas Luther, the more Richardson sensed that he was no longer looking for a missing person. He was now looking for a body. In Thomas Luther, Cher had picked the wrong shoulder to cry on. A known sex offender, Luther was fresh off a 10-year prison sentence for attacking and raping a young woman. He had bragged in jail that when he got out, the police wouldn't find the next woman he killed. This time, he'd be sure to bury the body where it would never be found. Richardson set out to foil that plan.
Our focus of the case at that time was to try to find the body of Cher Elder for two reasons. We needed it for prosecution and the family.
Richardson questioned Luther, who claimed that after leaving the casino, he dropped Elder off at her boyfriend's house. Luther's car was seized and searched for evidence, but nothing suggesting murder was found. For weeks, Richardson pressed on. Though he had very little hard evidence, knowing that this girl's body was out there somewhere kept the detective searching. To outsmart a clever criminal like Luther, Richardson would need to raise the suspect's level of uneasiness, hopefully compelling him back to the gravesite for a cautious once-over.
The prior day, I called Luther up at home and intentionally meant to sound really confident. I told him, hey, we got some evidence and I want you here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, hoping that it would increase his anxiety and he would make a mistake.
Richardson succeeded in flushing his quarry out of the brush. An informant told him that Luther planned to return to the grave early the following morning. If the body had been dug up, he planned to flee the state immediately. Meanwhile, undercover officers cast a wide net over the metropolitan Denver area, tailing Luther's acquaintances and scouting major roads. The morning of his meeting with Richardson, police observed a man in a car parked beside the road. Soon, police saw Luther emerge from the woods and get into the car. He proceeded to his meeting with Richardson, cocky with the knowledge that his pursuer was bluffing. Without a body, Richardson couldn't hold Luther. He was bound by law to release him and his car. Months passed without any progress on the case. Meantime, the prime suspect moved out of state. With each passing day, the more likely it seemed that Cher Elder's demise would forever remain a secret between the killer and the victim. The only thing keeping Richardson going was the faith that Cher Elder was buried somewhere in Empire Valley. But finding her in the craggy lowland would be an arduous task.
This valley is about 15 miles in length. And as you get out there, when you start looking for a possible location of the grave, it's nothing but rock slides and piles of rocks. And there's so many potential areas that a body could be hidden in that it just became a maze.
Weeks of foraging around Empire Valley left detectives empty-handed and frustrated. Finding Cher Elder's body in this rough terrain required a kind of expertise that would tax the resources of almost any police department.
Was that any good? Yes. Hopefully we would.
Aware that he'd reached his department's limits, Detective Richardson was running out of options. But he wasn't quite ready to throw in the towel. The relentless detective had one final inspiration. He contacted NecroSearch, an elite corps of scientists that uses a wide range of disciplines to locate clandestine graves.
NecroSearch exists because a group of law enforcement officers and scientists got together and figured there had to be a better way to find murdered or buried people and evidence.
Towards that goal, NecroSearch has assembled leading scientists from all over Colorado, comprising 15 specialties, including botany, geology, geophysics, forensic anthropology, and entomology.
53972.
The fundamental premise of NecroSearch is that buried bodies change the ecosystem around them forever. The soil above a grave may sag under rain or snow. Specific vegetation may flourish on the decomposing body.
53969.
Insects and scavengers arrive.
This is a case of a lifetime. This took everything that we had, everything that we could use of other sources from other agencies. That's why NecroSearch was requested to come in and assist. It was real simple. We're a largely populated community here. We're in the metro Denver area. We don't have expertise in going out looking for graves. We don't have very many graves dug in the city.
So far, the all-volunteer NecroSearch team has participated in over 100 cases in 30 states and 7 countries. The group convenes monthly to review potential cases. For most petitioners, like Detective Richardson, NecroSearch represents a final glimmer of hope.
I was asked by NecroSearch to come to their meeting and present the case to see if it was something that NecroSearch could assist me in. And so the case presentation was made to NecroSearch at that time. And boy, they asked me questions that I'd never thought of, such as what color was the dirt on Luther's pants when he came to get his car, because that may indicate he crawled out of a mine shaft or he may have been in a sand pit. And it was pretty apparent right then that when I contacted NecroSearch, these are the people that can help me because they have the experience in trying to locate a grave.
The rocky terrain hampered the endeavor, making disturbances in the soil difficult to spot. The team probed the earth for clues undetectable to the human eye.
On the geology side, we're looking for disturbances in the layering. And everything is layered. You wouldn't think so, but you come out here, you dig down a few feet, you'll find various layers within the rock, or within the soil, and we're looking to see where that's been disturbed.
Ground sweeps, aerial searches, and infrared analysis ruled out many potential grave sites. But still, as the months passed, no body was found. It seemed like Thomas Luther's boast about outsmarting police was coming true. In late January of 1995, a tip led Detective Richardson and NecroSearch to a steep, piney slope off the highway. Rocks covered most of the area. A grave could be disguised anywhere. NecroSearch did some preliminary testing of the location, but were shut down because of weather. It was now nearly 2 years after Cher's disappearance.
You don't like me and I don't like you, and that ain't no...
Then a crucial break came. Byron Powers, Cher's boyfriend, landed in prison for assault. It seemed Cher had a fatal lapse of judgment in her choice of companions. In an effort to lessen the charges against him, Powers dangled a piece of information in front of the police. He said he knew that Luther had killed Cher Elder, and he knew where he'd buried her body. Powers had been there about 3 weeks after Cher's death to help Luther better conceal the grave. Powers directed Richardson right past the point where the NecroSearch team had given up. Unlike most killers who hastily dump bodies downhill, Luther had taken his time in selecting a grave that would seem an improbable choice to police.
What we ultimately learned is that Thomas Luther carried the body of Cher Elder straight up a hillside by a rock slide and went uphill, which is uncommon.
The pile of rocks that Powers pointed out was less than a foot from the place that Richardson and NecroSearch had been testing shortly before the weather had forced them to quit.
We were 2 inches from the body of Cher Elder when we quit digging the first time. We went back, excavated to remove the body of Cher Elder.
As if setting up an archaeological excavation, the team established a grid and embarked upon an old-style dig. Laboriously, the team scraped soil 10 centimeters at a time. Archaeologist Steve Ireland was part of the search for Cher Elder's remains.
There, the initial 2 or 3 inches of ground was frozen. It was, January or February, as I recall. And so there we had to use a pick in order to get that top couple of inches, which was frozen off.
After 4 days and 2 feet of digging, the team reached bone. Excavated with fine hand tools like whisk brooms, toothbrushes, and bamboo sticks, the remains of a body finally took shape in the frozen soil. Dental records would identify the body as Cher Elder. Preliminary autopsy results showed that the young woman had been shot in the head 3 times, execution style. This discovery might have been enough evidence to convince a jury that Luther had killed Elder. But prosecutors would have a much better chance if they knew the time of death. If the body had been buried at least 2 years ago, a time when Cher was known to have been with Luther, the charge of murder would be much easier to prove in court. The team's careful excavation uncovered a clump of plant roots growing into the victim's soft flesh. NecroSearch called in botanist Vicki Trammell to extract and preserve them. Could she determine the time of burial from this botanical evidence?
when digging is done and roots are cut, this stimulates growth of new roots into the fresh backfill dirt. So the idea was that these roots ought to be about the same general age as the grave.
In order to determine the age of the new growth, the roots were sent to a lab where they were cut crosswise and stained, highlighting the characteristics of the cells. Most woody species of trees, like the pines and firs that forested the area near the victim's grave, form their roots in the same way, and the new roots have a particular pattern of cells that can be recognized under the microscope. Most of the differences involve the xylem, which is the water-conducting tissue in the plant.
And what I'm seeing is the water-conducting tissue kind of in a triangle. And it's the triangle shape that tells me that that is a very young root, about a first-year root.
Another year's growth sees a significant change in the cells. The triangle of tissue gives way to larger water-conducting cells.
This tells me it's a secondary root.
From their cellular structure, Trammell estimated the roots to be 2 years old. Her findings sealed the case against Thomas Luther, proving the grave was dug at a time after he was released from jail and known to be with the victim. In the end, a jury was convinced that Thomas Luther killed Cher Elder. He was sentenced to 48 years in prison with no chance of parole. Thanks to the tireless pursuit of Scott Richardson and the cutting-edge forensics of the NecroSearch team, the odyssey had finally come to an end.
I myself don't believe in what they call closure. I believe if you lose a loved one, that you will feel that loss for the rest of your life. But at least if they know what happened, they possibly can get on with their life in some way.
After the case ended, NecroSearch paid Detective Richardson the ultimate honor and inducted him into their selective ranks. Without his determination, Cher Elder would still be hidden in a desolate grave. The Earth is an impartial eyewitness to murder. But forensic botany and geology are finding ways to gather its testimony. Crimes considered unsolvable a few years earlier are now being won on the basis of roots, seeds, and sand. The landscape has become grounds for conviction, but we've only begun to scratch the surface.